Hello and welcome. I'm Joanne Lasowski, author and journalism educator. We are here to discuss issues of importance to the Caucasus, and with me today is Paul A. Goble, American analyst, writer and columnist, and writer of a daily blog called Window on Eurasia since 2004. He's also the former advisor on Russian affairs to Secretary of State James Baker. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Let's get right to discussing things about Russia. Just last week, we learned that the OSCE will not be able to send observers to the upcoming Russian Duma election, which happens in September. These observers are being shut out by the Russian Federation authorities. The official reason given are rather unclear, some kind of pandemic-related entry restrictions. What do you make of this tactic?
I think first the OSCE decided on its own not to send observers given the restrictions that the Russian government wanted to impose. The Russian government has already taken steps to isolate polling places in such a way that it will be very difficult for monitors to follow what's going on. The most important thing to remember about the upcoming September 19th Duma elections is that they will take place for the first time over 3 days. That will make it almost impossible for in-country monitors to track what's going on because there will be large periods of time, more than 12 hours, between each of the 3 days. And the OSCE, I think, reasonably concluded that it would, if it participated, if it went, it wouldn't be able to do an assessment, and its presence might even be manipulated by the Russian government to suggest that if the OSCE wasn't condemning what happened, that legitimated what Vladimir Putin is doing. So I think the decision not to go had less to do with the pandemic and more to do with Russian restrictions and concerns in the West that what Mr. Putin is about in this election, as increasingly has been the case over the last 2 decades, is not to have a free and fair election, and that participating in a nominal evaluation of it tends to legitimate what he does rather than allow serious criticism that might change things. Most international monitors want to participate in a place where if they identify problems, there is at least some hope that they will be corrected. That's no longer true in Vladimir Putin's Russia.
But again, these are Duma or parliamentary elections, not presidential elections.
Well,
the presidential elections are scheduled for, what, 2024, right?
Right. This is legislative both at the all-Russia level for the State Duma and also for about a third of the legislative chambers of the federal subjects. So there will be a lot going on, and quite frankly, I think the elections in the federal subjects will be more interesting than the ones for the Duma as a whole. I think the Kremlin has decided the outcome it wants, and it will do what it has to do to get that outcome. The most interesting thing, I believe, is that the Kremlin has stopped trying to boost participation. It's clearly decided that it would rather have low participation with people voting closer to what it wants, with its people showing up, rather than boosting participation, given how unpopular United Russia, Vladimir Putin, and the entire government apparatus is. They can still count on the people they pay. They will get their votes. If no one else votes, they'll have a majority or close to it without having to engage in massive falsification. At the regional level, however, the situation will be a little more complicated because Moscow doesn't control the process there as fully, at least in many cases. There are just too many regions. There are more than 80, and having your ability to monitor and then intervene in all of those at any one time is not easy, even for a dictatorship like the one Mr. Putin has.
So these elections that are coming up will not really have any effect on Putin as a leader, but the Russian Federation authorities are treating these elections as if they signal significant changes in government. They raided a conference of independent municipal lawmakers and activists, shut down 2 Russian news outlets and legal aid groups for being undesirable. Why are Russian authorities so nervous about these parliamentary elections?
I think those things would have happened if there were no elections scheduled. I think the repression that's been growing in Russia under Vladimir Putin would have continued much the same whether there were elections this September or not. I think that while the elections have been invoked by some commentators as the explanation, it seems to me that what Putin has been doing is trying to eliminate the opposition as such. He doesn't want street demonstrations. He doesn't want protests. He doesn't want negative coverage in independent media. And that's been a constant. That's not something that happens only in the 6 months before an election. That's been something that he's been doing right along. I actually do think these elections are likely to lead to some interesting changes. But they're not the changes people are currently talking about. I think it's very, very likely that the tensions that have emerged between United Russia and Vladimir Putin on the one hand, and the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, the KPRF, on the other, will mean that Putin will try to decapitate the KPRF by pushing its current leader, Gennady Zyuganov, into the Federation Council and forcing the party to come up with a new leader that perhaps Putin can control more readily. I also think it's possible that in the coming months we will see an effort to do the same elevation to Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the head of the ridiculously named Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, the most right wing of the so-called systemic opposition. And that party could very well be disbanded. So we may see a very different cast of characters 6 months from now. We won't see that in the immediate wake of the elections. That would be too soon to expect it. But clearly, Mr. Putin is looking to 2024. That's an election he cares about because he's going to be running in it. And while I'm sure he will make sure that the reported results show him to be winning, that it's less clear that the real results would. And so that being the case, I think what's going on now is just simply a running up as a test match for the real competition 2 years from now.
So let's move a little bit closer to the Caucasus now. How would you comment on the deployment of Russian border troops on the Armenian and Azerbaijani border? I know we've talked about this several times. How does it affect the balance of power in the region to have the Russian troops there?
Well, the first thing, there are several things that need to be said. The first and perhaps most important is that Russia has been responsible for guarding Armenia's borders since 1992. This is not a new thing. There is a question about Russia guarding the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. And the reason that Mr. Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia, has asked for border guards rather than peacekeepers is to try to take the issue of getting more Russian border guards out from the question of the November and January declarations, which called for trilateral consultations about anything like that. But the reality is Russian border guards have been on the Armenian border with Georgia, the Armenian border with Turkey, and the Armenian border with Iran since 1992. That's not new. What is new is the question of their being on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan and being on the border of the unrecognized Armenian clan state of Artsakh which is part of Azerbaijan, but which the Russian peacekeepers continue to recognize as an authority that they consult with there. It is striking that Moscow itself has not commented on what it's going to do. What we know about the plans for, or the discussions about what will happen next as far as border guards on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border, comes from the Russian ambassador in Yerevan, not from Moscow. I stress that because it may mean that this will be disowned at some point. But if we accept what he said, then three things are clear. First, there are going to be Russian border guards on much of the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Azerbaijani forces have pushed back to where the border was in 1991. That's the first thing. The second thing is there are going to be Russian border guards and not peacekeepers on any corridor that might open between Azerbaijan and the non-contiguous autonomy of Nakhichevan. And third, the question is, are there going to be peacekeepers, or excuse me, are there going to be Russian border guards around Artsakh? Some Armenian commentators have taken the Russian ambassador's remarks to mean that will be true. The Russian ambassador himself says that requires consultation with Baku. Now, a trilateral consultation. My guess is that we will see, they've already announced that about 4,500 more border guards are going to be there. And they're going to be enough that changes the power relationship in the Karabakh-Artsakh area. My guess is it'll be a mixed force, and my guess also is there won't be any consultations with Baku. What Moscow is doing with this is freezing the conflict, because Azerbaijan is not about to attack Russian border guards. It's just not going to happen. And there is a second thing that is related to this, which is part of the Russian effort to freeze the conflict so that it can continue to exploit the tensions with both sides. And that is that Moscow is desperately trying to get the United Nations to send officials from the High Commissioner for Refugees to Stepanakert. The reason for doing that is the High Commissioner is already on record as favoring the return not only of Azerbaijani refugees, but Armenian refugees. And what that means is it opens up the question of Shusha. It opens up the question of Armenians who may have left the buffer areas because of the advance of Azerbaijani troops. So my guess is that we will see Russian border guards on much of the Armenian-Azerbaijani border, and they will play an increasing role around Artsakh/Karabakh. The Azerbaijanis are not going to be happy about this, but it's not quite clear what they can do. The one thing they could do would be a real step, and that would be to ask Turkey to open a military base. Russia clearly thinks that by doing this, it will make the Azerbaijanis think twice about doing that. But in fact, what Russia has done opens the way for such a base, precisely because if Moscow can claim that it's putting its people there on the basis of an accord with Yerevan alone, then it is saying that Russian troops are on Armenian territory. Azerbaijan is therefore, under international law and by simple equity, equally capable of saying we would like a Turkish military base on our territory. That's speculative. I don't see anybody pushing that right now, but I think that's one of the things that may come out of this, especially if it dawns on Baku that what Moscow is doing is promoting a new frozen conflict, a new status quo that simply has Russian border guards playing the role that Armenian troops and border guards played on the Armenian-Azerbaijani dividing line in the past.
So let's talk a little bit about Nakhchivan. The Russians want to be deployed in that corridor as well?
They want, if any corridor opens, the Armenians want it to be Russian border guards, not Russian peacekeepers, because the Russian border guards would not be subject to a trilateral approval, and that would give Armenia yet another lever to try to block the opening of that corridor. This becomes infinitely more important because of another development of about 3 weeks ago. As you know, in December of last year, Baku and Ankara agreed to open a gas pipeline between Izmir in eastern Turkey and Nakhchivan. That would mean that natural gas could be provided to Nakhchivan from Turkey rather than as now as a result of swap agreements with Iran through Iranian territory. And that's been an arrangement in place since 2005. What we're talking about now is the construction and opening, supposedly early next year, of a pipeline from Turkey. That pipeline will parallel the rail line that's also being constructed, the opening of the cornerstone, or what, golden spike, or whatever you call the opening of a railway construction, began, I believe, in February this year. And so we're talking about a Turkey playing a much bigger role in Nakhchivan than it has before. That will, of course, mean that Turkey will have a much bigger interest in pushing for the corridor between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan proper. It will also mean that Iran and Russia will do what they can to resist it. I think what's going on with Armenia and the border guards is part of that. And I would urge everyone to remember that the Nakhchivan residents are going to be getting gas, and they're going to have a train which will allow economic development. What they're not getting from this deal is water. And most of the water that the people in Nakhchivan consume and that their industries use comes from rivers that are controlled by Iran. So Iran may very well deploy a water weapon against Nakhchivan in the near term. The decision to go forward with a pipeline certainly unsettles the South Caucasus, but it doesn't change anybody's basic interests. And that probably means that the conflict continues, but it may now involve water rather than oil and gas. And it means that Azerbaijan will have Turkey even closer to it than it did, but there will now, as it gets closer, the final space between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan proper, Zangezur for Azerbaijanis, or Syunik for Armenians, is going to become much more a cockpit of conflict in the coming weeks and months. So I'm quite struck by the decision of Turkey and Azerbaijan to go forward with these two projects. I'm also struck that what's going on with Russia and the border guards is all part of this same constellation of conflict.
So, but you mentioned this, or you hinted at this a little bit earlier, that the deployment of these Russian border guards in Armenia hasn't even been made official yet. What's holding this up? This was supposed to be one of the key issues during Pashinyan's visit to Moscow. Is there still struggle?
No, there have been Russian border guards in Armenia since 1991.
Okay.
They didn't go. They weren't absent and came back. They're still there. The question was, they had been clearly defined for the Georgian border, the Turkish border, and the Iranian border. And they were, the Armenian military and Armenian border guards generally have handled the border along Nakhchivan to its north. during the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan before the violence last year, Armenia had advanced into Azerbaijani territory. There was no place where Azerbaijan and Armenia had a border that was anywhere close to being a common one. The Armenians had pushed east, and so what we're talking about now is how to address that. And the Armenians have cleverly, from their own point of view, insisted that this be a border guards question, which falls under the agreement of January-February 1992, rather than being a peacekeeper issue, which would flow from the declarations of November 2020 and January 2021. There isn't an introduction to court of Russian border guards. There's an expansion of a longstanding presence, and that gives Armenia, in its view, the right to do that. I mean, the agreement, as I understand it, from 1992, allows Armenia to ask for more, to get more border guards. There are two things in conflict. One is the 92 agreement, and then the November and January declarations, which seem to point in a different direction. But if Armenia is taking the position that any corridor would need to be guarded by Russian border guards as well, that's a step forward, and it's clearly one that some in Moscow would like to see. How far this is going to happen, I don't. In fact, it may happen without a Moscow announcement. In other words, we may not see the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, come out and announce we're putting these people. It may just happen on the ground. And that, quite frankly, will make it more difficult for Baku to mobilize support against it.
Why are we seeing more protests in Baku against this deployment?
I'm sorry?
Why aren't we seeing more protests?
I think because it's not yet all taken place, and because I think it hasn't been fully explained. When Alexander Shmulevich was in Baku last week talking about the UN High Commissioner, people acted as if he was speaking about the far side of the moon, when it's quite obvious that he's right, that what Moscow is trying to do is to refreeze the conflict to its benefit. My guess is that over time, Azerbaijani, and it's summer, it's August. I mean, August is a season when people are on vacation, so not everyone is writing all the time. But my guess is that if Azerbaijani military starts seeing Russian border guards opposite their positions, that will then lead to a great deal of anger, and it's entirely possible protests in Baku and elsewhere, because then it will be clear that Armenia does not really plan to live within the November and January agreements as Baku understands them, but is interpreting them in a different way and with Russia's support. And so all of this has the potential to raise the temperature in the South Caucasus in serious ways. I hope that it won't lead to violence, but I don't think that could be excluded, especially if the Russians adopt a very forward-leaning policy with respect to Russian border guards on the claimed borders of Artsakh, which Armenian forces do not now control most of it, and where putting Russian border guards there as opposed to Russian peacekeepers would imply that Russia accepted those borders as something more than a line of control and as legitimate. And indeed, there has been at least one commentator, one Armenian commentator, who has written in Moscow in the last several days, that Moscow has become the guarantor of the continued existence of Artsakh. Now, if that, as I say, if that happens, I would expect reaction in Baku fairly promptly.
There's a lot of really significant rhetoric coming out of Armenia. I know just last week, the newly appointed Armenian defense minister gave the order to shoot and destroy any Azerbaijani soldier who attempts to cross the Armenian border. So all of this rhetoric coming out. And then, is it true that Russia says, they say they're concerned about these frequent armed incidents and this rhetoric, but do you see them as being honest about that? You're saying that they're hoping that this continues.
No, I'm not saying they're hoping for violence. I'm saying
not for violence, but the freeze, right?
I think they want to freeze it, and I think that their point of view is the threatening language coming from Yerevan, and any threatening language in the future that may come from Baku provides a justification from the international community to the international community for Russia to expand its presence to keep the two apart. I mean, to say that Russia will make use of such rhetoric is all I'm saying. That what it wants is a justification for a continued, even permanent Russian presence, no solution of the underlying problems, no opening of the corridors, and that creates a situation where at some point, those in Azerbaijan who felt that Azerbaijan stopped the fighting too soon may gain influence, because unless Moscow were prepared to intervene far more massively than these border guards, those they are a tripwire at most. Azerbaijani forces could take Stepanakert and they could seize Syunik. I'm not saying they should. I'm not saying that that's the best course of action, because I think it would create other problems. I guarantee you it would mean a massive Russian presence in Armenia and forever. And that's a security problem for Baku too. Much better to have some kind of an agreement, bilateral agreement between Baku and Yerevan. But if the Russians are showing themselves to be the, quote, last guarantors of Artsakh, there are going to be people in Baku who are going to say, we can show that isn't true. And especially given that I find it impossible to imagine that any Azerbaijani refugee would be happy to return home where he had to pass through a Russian-controlled checkpoint. I just don't think that's possible. And I think it's critically important that we pay the closest possible attention not only to what Russia is saying, but what Russia is doing. And the amount of coverage in the last couple of weeks of what it's doing has been less than one would like. Again, a product of the summer dog days, as it were.
So, again, getting back to some rhetoric that we've heard recently, Putin's mouthpiece, Chernovsky, recently made threats toward President Aliyev's government. He said that Russia should return to all territories of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, since the South Caucasus is a zone of Russian influence. And he added that only Russia can save President Aliyev from being overthrown by the West. What's the strategy behind this kind of rhetoric?
Zhirinovsky is, I would not say, is an absolutely reliable articulator of Vladimir Putin's plans and intentions. He is a flamboyant figure who has said all kinds of weird things. So I would not impute to Putin necessarily accepting everything Zhirinovsky says. Having said that, Vladimir Putin clearly would like to restore the empire in some form. I personally believe that he's not prepared to accept and to extend the empire to include large numbers of non-Slavic peoples, with the exception of the Armenians, who are also Christians. I think that we're not. I don't think that Mr. Putin would get much support for retaking Central Asia. He doesn't want the problems. He wants to be influential, but he doesn't want the social welfare costs of a large and growing population that's very poor. I don't think he would mind having Azerbaijani oil, but he'd have to have Azerbaijan without the Azerbaijanis. And I don't think that's a realistic possibility, despite the talk a century ago of Russia wants Armenia, it doesn't want Armenians. I think that Putin's vision of the future empire is Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and maybe one or two other places, Moldova possibly, although less likely, Armenia also possibly, but also less likely. I think that Zhirinovsky is being extravagant, and it attracts attention precisely because of how extravagant he is. But I don't think Vladimir Putin thinks he can do that. I mean, the fact is, he thought he was going to overthrow the Ukrainian government by his seizure of Crimea and his invasion in the Donbass. That hasn't happened. Instead, we have a Ukraine today which has a bigger and better and more prepared army to resist the Russians than it had in 2014. We have a government in Kiev which is as much or more committed to joining the EU and NATO as in the past. I think that we have to be careful in evaluating what Mr. Putin says and what in fact happens. There's a tendency to accept Putin's statements about what's going to happen and then forget that they don't work out. I really don't. I don't. First of all, I don't believe that the Azerbaijani people are about to overthrow the Aliyev government. I do hope that Azerbaijan will move in a more democratic position over time. But I will go to my deathbed remembering that his father once told me face to face that before you can be a democratic country, you have to be a country. You have to have a country, and that what followed from that was that living in a place where a major regional power doesn't want you to be a country makes it very difficult to make that transition. The reality is that if Russia were not behaving like a neo-imperialist power, an awful lot of the countries around it would be doing very much better. Thank you very much. And Russia is a troublemaker under Vladimir Putin, and it will continue to be a troublemaker as long as he's in the Kremlin. One can hope, however, that with time, Russia will recognize that the way it's trying to pursue what it wants will have exactly the opposite consequences to what it intends. That it will find itself surrounded by ever more countries which hate its guts and don't want to have anything to do with it. That's not because of the policies of the United States or the European Union. That's because Russia has made itself into an enemy for these countries. And it can do that with Azerbaijan very quickly. Indeed, I think some of what's going on right now is going to seriously degrade Russian influence in the Azerbaijani capital. I can't hear.
I'm still sorry. I'm having trouble with my mic here. Let's take a closer look at Armenian politics. Prime Minister Pashinyan has now formed his government, much to the dismay of Moscow. So Armenia seems to have avoided being sort of taken over, at least politically. The question remains, is this Russian pressure on Pashinyan over?
No, it'll never end. The Russians will continue to put pressure. The problem is that Russia wants to do a lot of things, but it's overplayed its hand routinely. And yes, Armenia wants certain things from Russia. It certainly does. And living where it does, it needs allies. Having said that, Russia's heavy-handed approach to dealing with its neighbors, including Armenia, has produced Pashinyans. And he's behaving exactly as you would expect. The Russians have not yet learned that they are in a security trap with all of their neighbors. And that is, the harder they press these countries to subordinate themselves to Russia, the more these countries will try to be anything but subordinate to Russia. That a friendlier, more equal treatment approach to these countries would win Russia a lot of points. But that's not the style of Vladimir Putin and his government.
So a little bit more about the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It's clear that Russia wants Azerbaijan to join that, right? What are the chances that Baku will join that?
Not very great if things go on as they are right now. And it's also not entirely clear what that institution will mean. I think the Russians set things up and we sort of assume they matter. Well, they set up the Commonwealth of Independent States, which still exists, but which doesn't matter very much. I used to keep on my desk a note that said the last meeting of the League of Nations took place in 1946. Institutions routinely are created and then outlive their usefulness or lose it, and that was a reminder of that. I'm not sure the Organization for the Security Treaty is going to matter all that much, and I suspect that Azerbaijan isn't going to agree to that unless it gets a big payoff. If Moscow came in and said, we're in favor of giving you Zangezur, sure, I think Baku might agree to a lot of things. But if Moscow does that, it will lose Armenia forever. It will alienate Iran. Mm-hmm. It will lose North-South trade. It will lose the trade with Central Asia to the west. And Moscow isn't quite yet prepared to do that, just so that Baku will sit at the table of the Organization of the Collective Security Treaty.
So you talked a little bit about this earlier, and many observers in Azerbaijan fear that Moscow is putting pressure on Baku to step away from Turkey. And now this pipeline is happening. How does that fit into?
Well, the Russians would like Azerbaijan not to have any allies other than Russians, and so Turkey is playing a role. Russia doesn't like that. It would like that the only ally that Baku would have would be in Moscow. Yes, Moscow's going to continue to talk about that. It's going to continue to talk about how your real friends are in Moscow, not in Ankara. But the fact is that linguistically and culturally, the basis for two states, one nation isn't going anywhere. And while I don't expect Azerbaijani-Turkish relations to be without clouds, I think there are real differences of opinion on some pretty important questions, not least of which is that Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has not yet really decided whether his Turkic world involves states or nations. Those are two very different things. If it's a union of states, then you look at the dozen or so countries that are Turkic. If it's a union of peoples, that's a very different phenomenon and has different consequences for Azerbaijan because it sets in play the question of southern Azerbaijan in a way that my guess is, for the time being at least, Baku doesn't want to go.
So thank you, Paul. This has been great. I want to finally close with talking a little bit more broadly about the peace agreement. Several weeks ago, President Aliyev said, we offered Yerevan the peace agreement draft. Baku is ready to sign the peace agreement, the peace treaty. But he added that there's been no response from Armenia. How realistic are the hopes for peace in this region?
Well, I think that what President Aliyev did was a very clever move by someone who wants to put pressure on the other side. I'm sure the Azerbaijani peace agreement, as offered, wanted the border between the two countries to be that it existed in 1991. Armenia could never agree to that, at least openly. That might be the result of negotiations, but to accept that at the beginning is unthinkable from an Armenian point of view. And this whole conflict for the last 30 years has been about the idea that the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan is not legitimate. So I didn't expect it to go anywhere. I expected it only to have some impact on Azerbaijanis at home, that our government is interested in peace, which is a good thing. I expected it to have some impact on the Western partners of Azerbaijan, who would say Baku's being forthcoming. But I saw no reason to think that either Yerevan or Moscow would want to accept that, even in any possible way. The beginnings of talks, possibly. The idea that you would sign on to something which no Azerbaijani president could present anything other than 1991 borders and Karabakh is ours, was simply not something that Armenia could accept. It's just not as an opening bid. Wasn't going to happen.
Well, there's going to be plenty of things to talk about in the future about this region.
Not going away.
Thank you, Paul A. Goble, for your time, and we appreciate your insights, and we'll be back.
Thank you.